Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Time. And thank you guys so much for being here. Um, it's been an interesting 24 hours. Uh, yeah, today was supposed to be our premiere, and we were, for those of you who don't know, which I think is probably the minority, we were in the process of uh, just testing and getting ready, and we were sort of still in beta with the layout and the software and everything, and we were in the process of getting ready, and then I saw on our news ticker down at the bottom, I saw breaking news about a hostage situation and shootout in Philadelphia, and so I call up Ansgar and I was like, here's a stupid question. Do you want to go live with this? Because that's one of the things that we are going to be um, doing is commentary and sort of social integration on breaking news stories. And it was a day early, but I was like, are we really stupid enough to try it? And I think Ansgar gave me the answer to that one.
I was like, of course we are. Of course we're dumb enough to try it.
Do you even need to ask?
Right. Let's go for it. We'll do it live.
Well, yeah, we're going live. Um, and thanks to Hi.
Speaking of bull rushing into it, by the way, our whiteboard center frame is missing again.
Yes, I know. I'm going to work on that. Well, we had also because I don't want news on there when we're not doing a news show, and this is not a news show today, so it shouldn't be showing
Right.
news. And I was working on getting that all cleared up, and then I was like, we're running a little late, and there are some smarmy people in the live chat that might give us a hard time for not being on time. I'm
Yeah.
not talking about Hi Harry or anyone like that, of course. At any rate,
Of course.
no, no, not him. At any rate, so yeah, we ended up doing the show, and I thought it went actually really great. I had a good time. I think everything went as well as better than could be expected for
Yeah.
very beta and rushed. But of course we're behind. The layout isn't quite as done as I'd like it to be, and we're not we're
Yeah.
not
We've got some elements that we've actually finished. They aren't in the layout right now because, well, we just did not get enough time to work on it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, well, we blew one test that was supposed to be done yesterday because we went live instead, and then we lost all the live time, and then we just it's been one thing after another. But Ansgar, I think, did a spectacular job with the graphics here, and there's more that we're going to be uploading. And so the format, this is in theory our first episode. It's really our first scheduled episode. And
Hmm.
this show we're going to be doing. Political and social commentary and discussion on Thursdays, which is today. We're going to Ansgar and I think, are usually going to discuss a topic, and obviously invite questions from the live chat, and maybe give certain members of the live chat, Harry, a hard time. If they deserve it, which given the audience that we draw, I mean, I think it's a pretty foregone conclusion that our audience is going to deserve a hard time. But at any rate, and then Tuesdays we're going to be discussing topics, and I think you had sort of pointed out rightly so that it's the same kind of topics. It's just ones that we're not going to be as qualified to discuss. So we are going to be bringing on a guest to discuss it with us. So today's topic is
Correct.
which will start shortly, outrage and cancel culture, and then Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, which would be the 20th, we're going to have the effect of social media on politics and culture, and sort of also the inversion of how social media has changed. It used to be you couldn't talk about politics. Now, if you don't talk about politics, you can't be friends with someone until you know
Right.
their political allegiance or their religious. And
Yeah.
and Cheshire Vic is going to be joining us for that. And then we ostensibly actually also had, well, I'll get to the Wednesday one in a second. Then we're going to be discussing the sort of superheroes and the role of comic book heroes and sort of, I think, mythology also in informing our normative moral ethics. That's going to be on Tuesday. And then on the 27th, we're going to be discussing racism and tribalism in modern culture, and we have a guest planned for that, and I'm still trying to make contact with him.
Oh wait,
But
well, I thought
busy.
you said Tuesday. The superheroes thing's next Thursday, right?
Yeah, a week from today is the superheroes, and then the
Yeah.
Tuesday after that is going to be the tribalism in modern culture. Then we're going to be discussing gun control on the 29th, and we do have a full calendar. We'll make the calendar available somewhere so people can look at it. It's also on the intro and outro, which today is going to be the same screen. And we've got a full calendar there, and you can, of course, ask either of us on the Twitters, on the internets, and we'll help you out with that. We also have on Wednesday sort of the smaller topics that might not be of larger cultural interest, but that we're still interested in discussing. And right now, tentatively scheduled, we have sort of the non sequitur debacle scheduled for this coming Wednesday. So it's a full plate, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So today, and then the other thing, just so we're going to cover live breaking news, and hopefully do a good job covering it. I think we did actually a great job yesterday. Ansgar in particular was really on the social media and just dropping all sorts of really crazy stuff that was going on while I mean, I think my favorite meme would be the woman with the headdress with the Kit Kats and the Skittles, and she was
Yes.
handing them, dancing and handing them out so people could watch as a live shootout and hostage situation was unfolding. And I did get some comments from friends of mine in Canada in particular, who are just like, you're a crazy country. Just like, I don't need you to tell me that. I already knew, but thank
I'm
you.
telling you, that picture, I mean, it really invites a ton of social commentary on America in general. It really does. In fact, I would almost like to have an impromptu. We've got to bring that picture up when we talk about gun control. We really do, because that picture just invites a ton of commentary on so much.
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes with the live with the breaking news shows. I think one thing that I'd really like to do is we're going to collate the news stories for our viewers, and we're going to keep track of the breaking news and changes as they happen. I think we did that very well. We're going to keep track of multiple sources, but also the social media and what's going on there. And we did have a short impromptu discussion on that, but I think you're right. I think it needs a lot more. And I like the idea of the scrapbook. We're just going to have a scrapbook of some of the, and then the image of because the shooter live streamed his encounter with the police.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting screenshot. So
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be building out more and fleshing out more. I think we're going to discuss some of those plans a bit later. But I would like to get to the topic today. So hopefully now everyone knows what it is we do and what our goals are. And hopefully we will meet those goals. And in the meantime, would certainly like to have some interesting discussions. Outrage and sort of cancel culture. And so, Ansgar, I think I was hoping you could introduce us to this topic a little bit and start the
Sure.
discussion going.
Okay, so let's start off with what either outrage or cancel culture is. And I think outrage culture is kind of the classic. We really tend to think of it classically as more a product of the right that has probably because most of us grew up in the 80s and 90s when politically I think the right was more in charge politically, or at least it had more sway over what was considered politically correct at the time. But outrage culture is that kind of classic, oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't like this, so it shouldn't exist. It needs to go away. Cancel culture, however, is a rather recent thing. You will find people who, and it's kind of an outgrowth of social media in and of itself. People can organize rather large hostile mobs toward a person, toward a company, toward an idea that seem much larger portion of the population, simply because in social media you can get people that would never be able to meet any other way than on organizing around an idea online. If you're part of a very small minority group, we're talking not necessarily by skin tone, we're talking about by political leaning or the way you feel about a topic. It's very difficult to organize in the real world, out in the regular world, because there is distance to be considered and you may never meet. But online it's much easier to get, let's say, 10,000 people together that all think that this one thing is horrible, and they will harass artists, they will harass companies, they will harass all sorts of different entities if they think that something, is offensive, if something offends their sensibilities. And we've seen this, not just, people think of cancel culture as more of a left-leaning thing, and it mostly has, but it is by no means contained to that. And I want to bring up two recent examples of this, one from the right and one from the left. On the right, in a few states, Alabama being chief among them, yay Alabama, there was an episode of a kid's cartoon, very, very wholesome, that all it did was feature a gay wedding, right? Nothing weird about it. It was just a wholesome, sweet story. There wasn't even anything romantic about it. It was literally just these kids finding out that someone they knew was getting married, and it wasn't to the gender they thought this person would be, and getting to ask questions of this person.
Now is this that I forget and I've actually forgotten the name of it, but it's that the one with the bears, the little bear cubs is that the cartoon you're thinking of? Or
it's Arthur. I think it's called like Arthur.
It is. Yes, it's Arthur, and he's like this genius bear with. Yep, that's it.
Yeah. And so, that's really all it was. It was a sweet, wholesome gay wedding. Well, that got taken off the air in those states because it's going to fill kids with propaganda, and that's exactly what happened. Parents organized on social media. They harassed not the creators of the show, but the broadcaster, and so the broadcaster refused to put it on air. Now, a little more recently, a sort of an example from the left would be Sarah Silverman got fired from, she was going to be in a movie, I forget if it was a movie or a show, because somebody brought up an old comedy bit from like 10 years ago where she wore blackface. It was a comedy bit, and she was making fun of racism, of course. She was also on another show where she dressed as a Nazi, making fun of Nazis. And so she has been fired from that movie and from that show. So we can see this sort of people are realizing the power of social media, and they're sort of wielding their outrage as a culture and as a cudgel, excuse me. And what's more interesting about this is lately these little groups have realized how much power they have. I mean, truly realize, and they actually have embraced calling it canceling. Like, they actually say, let's get this person canceled. And they will email people's bosses and say, hey, look at all the horrible things we think they've done, and try to get people fired, try to ruin their lives. There are some people who can't even use services such as Patreon or PayPal or things like that because of these mobs. So that's really what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. Now, I think we're going to talk about it sort of generally today. Specifically, I think we did have some we wanted to talk about, because I think there's been some of that towards, for example, when Red's Rhetoric got into his kerfuffle with the ACA, and a lot of the consequences after that, and people.
You mean
Red's,
not
I said Red's,
Rhetoric.
yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. Rationality Rules.
Rationality Rules.
Yeah.
Two R's.
Get the two R's. Reds. I threw Reds under the bus there. So Hopefully he's not watching. Well, hopefully he is
Yeah,
watching.
no. Rationality rules definitely got into that, especially we saw it actually fracture the ACA over it
Yeah,
because there were some people not willing to condemn him hard enough.
yeah, and I think and that's a decent example of it on the left. I think you're right. I think both the hosts of this show do lean politically one way, and so I hope we can try to be oh God, I don't want to say fair and balanced, but I hope we can call out both sides. I've seen this problem,
Yeah.
I think, a bit more on that I'm thinking of sort of on the left, but you gave some very good.
I think the left was the first to realize the power of the social media to get this kind of thing done. I think the right is just catching up as far as that goes. Kind of like the right was really the first to embrace the memes and the power of those memes, and one might even argue that those memes were a huge part of getting Trump elected.
Oh
You know,
Jesus, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So yeah,
well, and that's where it cuts both ways because a lot of what people say, I am for under certain sets of circumstances, leaning towards platforming people with bad ideas. Um,
me too.
um, Now there are caveats to that. I don't think you just throw them on any platform and you give them, a mic. And I think, for example, a Holocaust denier, you don't put up with a Holocaust victim on the same show, especially where the Holocaust denier has practiced
That's just
arguments
about being sensitive, to be quite honest.
well, yeah, it's about. That's why I wanted to flesh that one out a bit. It's not just about sensitivity. The guy who was actually present at the Holocaust probably isn't experienced at arguing why it's real. They were there. That's not
Mm-hmm.
their role in life is to defend that it
Yeah.
happened. There are people who are prepared to engage on the topic of did this actually happen, and you put up a Holocaust denier with somebody who is practiced at dealing with Holocaust deniers, and a Holocaust victim is not necessarily a balanced
Right.
conversation. Um, but it's also phenomenally insensitive and just a genuinely bad idea on so many levels.
It's a dick move. It really is.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. We should. Okay, somebody needs to
To summarize it.
somebody needs to meme that for we have declared dick moves.
Yes.
We could have our own ongoing thing here for dick moves, and that'll be our first one. Um,
There you go.
but I think the problem is I'm not sure that this is a black or white situation because I find in cases with rationality rules in particular, and I don't want to assume that people know what it is, and I don't want to necessarily rehash it too much, so I don't want to get too much into what happened. But he did make some arguments that really he deserved pushback on. He got pushback on
Sure.
far more than I think what he made or intended to say, but and that's a whole nother issue. But he certainly deserves some pushback. But he was scheduled to be on the Atheist Experience. He went on. Nobody had any objection at the time, and it was sort of after the fact when this came out. And the Atheist Experience was for the most part, it seems to me, shamed into denouncing him. And
Right.
it was this: you're with us or you're against us. His comments were interpreted as being transphobic. They have a very large trans and gay audience, and they
For
didn't
good
want to
reason.
alienate. They didn't want to alienate that audience. And even if they didn't have the audience, if he's doing something that needs to be called out, you call it out. But the idea of saying, well, we would never have had him on, and I think this gets into how and when is it appropriate to do these things, or what lines are being crossed. So now we had talked about Arthur, and we had talked about and so I'm gonna hit with like 5 or 6 different things, which I would like to try not to make a habit of doing, but I want to do now just because I guess my brain is all over the place on them. So first and foremost, if you do have an objection to something that you're seeing on television, something that you think you should voice an objection to, what would be appropriate? Um, and I certainly, when we talk about trying to, because I have been for boycotting um, like when Hannity has done some of the things that I thought were just way beyond the pale. I was like, yeah, I'd call for boycotting his advertisers. And so how do I know when maybe that's a okay idea, but it's not an okay idea for boycotting Arthur or for the shows that sponsor, or sorry, the broadcast networks that sponsor Arthur. I do, and this does, unfortunately, the cancel culture, you had pointed this out, and I hadn't thought about this, but this is important too, which is I think we've all seen and know of people who have had trolls. If you're on Twitter nowadays, you're taking your life in your hands, your social and business life, because there are trolls that will call and try to get you fired. And I have friends who people try to get fired. I have people who aren't friends, but I know well who regularly somebody is trying to get them fired. Um, I oppose that for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which is I do think
Right.
you should be able to say what you want to say on Twitter. But I what and then but then you get Kevin Spacey. Should he have been kicked off of House of Cards? Who makes that decision? A lot of what was
Right.
said was accusations versus, and there was some substantiation, but how do you make a determine? Am I supposed to be the judge of that? And how much? And I think these are really difficult questions. So I don't know. I'll let you
Well, well,
talk about it.
what I want to ask is, what would our culture look like if every artist who ever had bad ideas was never allowed to create? What would our culture look like now? Like, really think about that. If the artists who sometimes have bad ideas, or one bad idea, or two bad ideas, were never allowed to create, if the intellectuals who had a bad idea or two were never allowed to ask questions, what would our culture look like now? And what world will our culture look like in the future if we aren't allowed to ask bad questions, if we aren't allowed to create because we have another bad idea? Why should we allow one bad idea, one bad argument, one bad question, one bad moment define who we are forever? You know what I mean? Like let's grant for a moment. Let's just say that Sarah Silverman's joke where she wore blackface is a horrible thing. Let's just grant that. I don't actually feel that. I think there's context to be involved, but let's just grant. Let's pretend like it really is the most racist thing ever. Why does she have to be defined by that? Why is that, what we decide is who she is now? That's where things seem egregious to me. It would be one thing if a figure like, let's say somebody wanted to have Richard Spencer speak at an event. It's one thing to call that event and say, listen, Richard Spencer is actively pushing for an ethno state. I don't think that he is a good person for you to have at your let's say diversity event. Let's just say, that there's one thing there. There's another thing to say. This artist one time did a long time ago did a thing that offends me, a thing that I'm upset about. I don't think they should ever be able to work again. And it's not
No.
like she was going to be doing that bit on this show. She did that bit a long time ago. In fact, now she's pretty into the woke culture now. So, what are you worried about? Are people not allowed to change?
Well, and there's
I think that's
context.
more.
I mean,
Yeah.
we tend to, and look, everybody's busy, and so you don't always have time to look at really the context and nuance. But so many times there is context and nuance that is getting
Mhm.
ignored. When you had mentioned her showing up in the Nazi uniform, I could be wrong, but if I recall, that was actually in response to Prince Harry,
Mhm.
because he had worn for Halloween a Nazi uniform, and obviously that drew a tremendous amount of outrage. I don't think a prince in the UK should be in a Nazi uniform. I understand why there's a lot of objection to that, but I think she was trying to make fun of him and also how sort of the high importance that's associated with a prince And so she was making a lot of complex commentary. If I remember, if this is that same incident, she was trying to make really commentary on not just the Nazi uniform, but why is it not okay for a prince to wear it, but
Mhm.
if it probably wouldn't be okay for anyone to wear it. But I think you understand what I'm saying, that we made a much bigger deal
Mhm.
about it because he's a prince. Um,
I wouldn't say that there's no context in which a Nazi uniform is not okay. I mean, are we
yeah.
going to demonize Mel Brooks at this point?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So, so I think a lot of people who would object to her bit probably didn't actually see it, and if they didn't apply the principle of charity to it too, because if you've made up your mind that what she's doing is wrong, and I saw a lot of that with the rationality rules thing too, where people just made up their minds that he was a transphobe. And so
Hmm.
once they've made up their mind, there's very little you can say that isn't going to add supporting evidence to that. You could say one statement and they're going to say, oh, yep, that proves it. And you could say the exact opposite statement and that would also prove it. Once somebody's really made up their mind, that was a line in which the Usual Suspects, where they're talking to Kevin Spacey's character, and he says, "Look, if you're a cop and you assume a guy's murdered and you think that his brother did it, you're going to find out you're right. No matter you're going to
Right.
find out if you've decided that rationality rules is a transphobe, you will find out you're right. If you've decided he's not, you're going to find out you're right. Um, our biases work very well to the confirmation bias. You will read into it, and that's why, and everybody knows this. I don't want to do civics 101, but that's why we have innocent until proven guilty. It's because your biases really will hang a person. And it seems to me that, and I like what you said. So what would you say? Because you are an artist.
Hmm.
So you have a very different perspective on it. I think that's why I really appreciate what you said. Listen, we're all human, and if every artist who did something stupid was, not allowed to talk, or not put
Or
on a
create. Yeah.
YouTube channel. So I'm not implying anything about you. At any rate, if if
I have never said anything stupid ever. Not once.
yeah, yes, you did. I said you want to do a show with me, and you said sure.
My next
Um,
line was going to be, "Don't ask my wife."
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, sorry,
Uh,
I stepped on your line. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
no worries, no worries.
Michael Jackson. What do you
Yeah.
think? What do you think about that?
Well, see, yeah, that's a tough one. Here, I've got two things to kind of two angles to come at that from. One is, should we apply the ethic of innocent and proven until proven guilty in the social context? You know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yep.
Should we give the principle of charity and assume everyone is innocent until enough evidence comes forward to truly convince us? Because that changes a lot of how we handle this. And I would argue that we kind of should. Right now we have a culture where the moment an accusation comes forward, somebody's entire career could be over, no matter how the any trial or evidence goes. Um, the other thing that I would say is, let's say, even bring it to someone like Cosby, who we can be really convinced that he did what he did. Can we separate? Do we allow the horrible things that person did to define their art? You know what I mean? Hitler has some amazing art. Can we put that up in a museum?
Yeah.
Really. Cosby, an amazing comedian in his time. Can we still enjoy that comedy? Michael Jackson, not my type of music, but did some amazing music, and he really did shape an entire generation's culture, in spite of the horrible things he very likely did, or maybe not, but very likely did. So do we define that art by the horrible things that they did? I would argue no. I would argue that if you look in any artist's closet, in fact, any human's closet, you're going to find some skeletons. You're going to find some reason to say, you know, get out of our culture, get out of our lives, you know, go. And I would argue, though, that art is so important to cultural stability, to growth, to the change of culture. You know, I once said that you know, one of the jobs of art is to thrust new ideas and into the culture, right? One of the great things about art is you can explore some of the most horrible things. You can explore sexual assault. You can explore genocide and racism and some of the most dangerous and vicious ideas in a space where no one actually gets hurt. These are fictional characters. These are fictional beings. These are fictional worlds. What have you? You know, Animal Farm as an example. And you can do it in a place where people feel comfortable and safe engaging with those ideas. And that allows a kind of cultural growth and change that is so valuable, so valuable. And if we make it difficult, where artists have to walk a line, where artists have to be careful of every little thing they do, or they're not only are they pushed out of the culture, but every work, all of their works, you know, have to be burned and castigated. I think that is dangerous for our culture. I think that there is a cultural impetus to allow forgiveness of at least the art itself. Maybe you don't forgive the artist, but at least forgive the art, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, before I continue, I do. If anybody has any comments, I'm trying to check in on the live chat every now and then. But if you tag me in it, I'll see it. It'll be highlighted in red, and I'll know, and it'll draw my eye. And if it's a question that you want me to bring up, I will, you know, tag me in it, and I will do my best. So a couple of things. You had said everybody's got skeletons in their closet, and I think that's true. But I think the concern is people who have like entire graveyards in their closet.
Well, yeah.
Is you know, so just because we all have skeletons in the closet doesn't some are little skeletons, and some
True.
are huge graveyards. So I think there is a spectrum. I am interested by the argument that you've made about art having such a high value that, you know, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But you can also say that of, you know, Bernie Sanders. If you're really into his ideas and you think that his ideas have significant value, obviously he'd be dead as a politician if you know, even if it was unrelated to politics. It's interesting. Now, Bill Clinton wasn't killed, but he was, and by that I mean, so politically he wasn't. He didn't by his infidelities, but it came close. He was impeached, and he survived it, but he also didn't do. He wasn't his quote crimes weren't nearly as severe. I do think one of the things that I found interesting was, so I guess my first question is, would artists enjoy a sort of a special privilege over other professions? And I think art is not recognized for the importance it has in general in our society, but how much I do think artists do need some extra leeway for making mistakes, because that happens when somebody's trying a brand new show, when somebody writes a scandalous book, when somebody tries something different. You know, art is good. You're going to suffer that in ways that you're not going to suffer those kinds of mistakes in other fields. So I do think that should be considered, but I don't know that grants one blanket immunity. I do think.
No, I'm not saying that someone blanket immunity,
Yeah.
but can we at least give? Okay, let's say, for instance, that you have an artist who is an amazing artist, and it comes to light that they are, or let's say they convert and become they start following Richard Spencer and they start talking about, ethno-nationalism and crap like that. It's okay to say that we don't want to hear your ideas. We're not going to, we know we don't want to put you on a show where you're going to be talking about ethno-nationalism and crap like that. It's another thing to say we're going to take the entire catalog of your works, get rid of it, and now this other thing that you were going to be part of that had nothing to do with any of your political ideas, you can't be part of that either. In fact, we're going to make sure that you can't work and make a living because you hold ideas that we find unacceptable. You know what I mean?
I
Especially if
do.
they're not even acting on them.
I do, but again, I think there's got to be a spectrum because at some point, um, engaging with the art, whatever it
Mm.
is some kind of endorsement. I don't know if it should be. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe we should be able to draw a clear, distinct line between the artist
Okay.
and
Let
the.
me let me let me ask you a question then.
Please.
Is watching old episodes of the Cosby Show endorsing rape?
Well, so I would have two things to say about that. First of all, I can't watch those episodes and enjoy them in the same way I used to, and that's an involuntary response. I just can't do that. And I think that's part of that phenomenon. I don't think it necessarily is, but I do understand why. I forget who was it was either TNT or a cable network that had just bought and was re-airing all the old episodes, and they canceled and refused to air any of the episodes again. I think that's an overreaction, but I do understand the impulse. Certainly, there were other people involved than just him,
Mm-hmm.
but I think part of how we correct inappropriate behavior or anything from inappropriate to just vile behavior is by having social consequences. So, and part of those consequences, it can be shunning in one way or another. Now, Cosby was convicted, so with him,
Mm-hmm.
it's an easier one. When the accusation just comes out, that's a and maybe I'm a hypocrite on this one but I think we do have to use our best judgment. When I took a look at the Kavanaugh hearings, uh,
Mm-hmm.
Kavanaugh struck me as guilty as hell. And when you took a look at his answers and how he treated the panel and how he engaged, he struck me as guilty as hell. And I said I don't think he should be confirmed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there are other cases where I sit there and say just the accusation alone shouldn't be sufficient. And so we all have to draw our own conclusions and I guess try to get educated on it, but we don't have time to sit there and educate ourselves on every single public kerfuffle that we see. So I have a hard time saying that there's necessarily a line. I guess what I'm trying to say is I do think that there is a difference between an artist and their work, but I don't think that difference is so inviolate that you can't go from it can't be broken if it gets bad enough. With Michael Jackson, the reality is I suspect Dennis Miller had said something once that I liked where he said, look, I think he played doctor with children and I think he
Mm-hmm.
was inappropriate. I don't think he pulled the trigger on anything hardcore. I don't think he was ever accused of doing that, and I think that's a nuance most people ignore. And again, I understand the impulse for ignoring it. But should radio stations be prohibited from playing his music? Should the fact, and you had said he influenced the culture. Yeah, he influenced the culture. He influenced musicians. He influenced so much. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's necessary that be tarnished and that you sit there and remember who it is. I don't know that excising it completely is. But I do think there need to be consequences, and I think that's also how artists who are coming up, who sit there and say, Well, I do want to watch my behavior some because, and we have to do this. It's not just artists that have to do this. Everybody has to do this in everything they do. You see,
Well, hold on though.
yeah,
Imagine though that what Michael Jackson had done, that he did that in that scandal came up in the age of social media. He may have been excised from the culture before he ever had a chance to influence it in a very positive and good way. Think of really, I know you want to I know in your head you want to tarnish it because that's the impulse, but really think of the positive things that he brought to the culture in spite of what he might have what he probably did, right?
yep,
He brought not only a love of music and dance to a lot of kids, and particularly inner city kids who didn't have much to look forward to. I mean, there was a lot of he had a lot of really positive, non-violent, enjoy art, enjoy music, turn away from violence type messages that were really positive for the culture at the time. Really, really positive. And if we create an environment where artists in particular feel as though they cannot be on the edge of social issues, right? What does that say for our culture?
well,
Really think about that.
I'd make 2 points. First of all, his problem wasn't that he was on the edge of social issues. What he was
No,
doing was criminal. So
I
there
agree.
there is a difference.
But hold on, those
Okay,
two often intersect.
they can.
Think about this, right? Think about um um let's say the age of decency laws,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Think about what art was like back then. Think how stale art was. Think how slow culture moved in the age of decency laws. Think, I mean, really, or even in the age of the great Renaissance masters, they were so limited in what they were allowed to create that even though they created, they advanced artistic technique to an incredible degree, they did almost no moving of the culture because they were stuck creating a very limited subject matter. And so when you start clamping down on artists, there really is a social detriment to it. And so there really is a place where artists would like to create things about social issues that maybe let's take it back a little while ago when something like even speaking about homosexuality would have been you can't do that. You would have been censored on TV, just everything, right? If an artist wanted to create a story that humanized homosexual characters, what would have happened to them? Do you think that they would have been willing to create that thing? You know what I mean? That to me, there is there is an impetus to me, especially when you're talking about an artist who is demonized for their art, like Sarah Silverman was.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
There is, to me, especially in that kind of case, a serious social value in allowing artists to create and not burning their art at the stake, so to speak, once they've done something that we have decided. Even I will decide, okay, this person has done something horrible. They are now a horrible person for what they've done. They've just done something too egregious. You can't come back from that, right?
Yep, yep.
Such as what Michael Jackson did or what Cosby did. I still don't think their art should be burned at the stake. Their art still has value. We can still look back and say, look at the amazing things they contributed to our culture.
Yeah, so I want to try to tease out two different things. So the first is, and like I said before, I do think artists need to be given extra
Mm-hmm.
leeway to be expressive that way with their art. But with Michael Jackson, we're talking something outside of his music that he did, and
Can I
whether that in
can I
Please.
interject 1 second.
Yeah.
Smitty said, I don't really buy the premise that popular music is a primary mover of public opinion. It's primarily entertainment. First of all, I would like to say I think that is patently false. We can see time and time again where music has and the messaging in music has helped shape entire generations. The Beatles, Pink Floyd, even in Nirvana helped shape an entire generation and the things that they thought. Not only that, but music can give underprivileged children in particular an outlet that is of great social value. And art does not have to have an opinion changing commentary to add value to our society. I wanted to point that out before we moved on.
No, I
Go
think
ahead.
I think that's a good and important point to make, and I tend to agree with you. I think there are a lot of songs I can't think of. I had a few sort of on the tip of my tongue, but I think there are a few that you can think of that really either defined or somehow changed a generation. I do think that happens. I don't think that's necessarily a reasonable expectation, but I think that has absolutely happened. And I think I think politics has driven culture, and culture has driven politics at different
Right.
times. So in regards to, I had said earlier that I do think that artists need to be given extra leeway to do their art. Otherwise, because if they're looking over their shoulder, they can't do anything cutting edge. And I think a lot of art has caused us to challenge ourselves and helps us move forward. The guy who did the Mother Teresa in excrement. I forget. I think it was what animal
Mhm.
excrement, but he had done the entire, and there were people who were deeply
Right.
offended by that. But I think they have to be allowed to attempt to do or say what it is that they're trying to say. And I think his message was lost also because it had nothing to do with he wasn't trying to make a political statement about her. Actually, it was about how artists use different resources in different areas, including excrement, if that's all they have to paint with. Um,
Right.
so I think that message was lost, and I think that has to be allowed for. I do think that um, there is value in social pushback against certain ideas, and
Certainly.
I think that intuitively comes by rejecting things about a person when when if they've crossed some kind of boundary, and in this case, what I am talking about is criminals. Sometimes I'm going to stick with Michael Jackson just for a minute. Um, Now, I think it's again, it's a spectrum, and I don't think it's a black or white issue, but I think part of that pushback can come in the form of rejecting the art. And while I admit that there is loss in that, and there's loss to people who could have benefited from the art, there is, I think, gain in checking people who because I wonder what would happen if you had the sort of reverse where you never had that kind of pushback. And I think of people really going sort of too far and feeling like there aren't consequences. If there isn't a criminal consequence, if you're not going to jail for whatever it is you've done, well, you can go ahead and do just about anything you want. And
Of course.
I think that social pushback is a huge part of it. And for artists, unfortunately, that pushback then becomes about the art. And the how and the why is I think a difficult issue because I do think it happens more than it should. I think it happens in cases where I wouldn't want to. Hold on a sec. I think we do it too easily, way too easily. So I'm not suggesting that the way we do it now is the best way to do it, but I think it still has to happen. It's just a question of how much. And I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm not for saying you have to pull, for example, the Cosby Show off the air. I do think there is benefit to at least having that discussion about, say, Bill Cosby's um, stand-up routines. And I am curious as to what it does
Mhm.
if you air those routines. If just Bill Cosby and you're airing his routines, what does that do to, say, his victims who have to see these being aired and have to see him being held as an icon for this
They
art?
don't have to.
Well, they have to because if he's famous and if he's held up as an icon for those things, they don't have to watch the art, but they do have to see him held up to that standard, and they have to see people sit there and say, "Hey, wow, I just saw this Cosby special last." They still have to be in a culture where he is held to this standard, and again, a culture where people may not be informed as to everything about him.
Right. I don't I hate to sound unfeeling, but I don't think that that is a concern that our culture needs to have, especially because we're all, think about it this way, right? I could say that a certain number of the culture has experienced, let's say, sexual assault, right?
Yes.
And there are excellent movies that, if a that are held to in high regard in our society, that have sexual assault, and every time that a sexual assault survivor has to see one of those movies, billboards or something like that, I am sure that it has some kind of a psychological effect on at least a great many of them. Do we need to be concerned about that? Do we need to say, hey, listen, we can't be making great films with that subject matter because there's a certain subset of the population that is very sensitive to that,
I think
and rightfully so
I,
sensitive.
well, I think we do need to be concerned. I don't think that means we don't air it or discuss it, but I think that just as you had said earlier that we wouldn't want to put a Holocaust denier and a Holocaust victim on the same set, we should be at least cognizant of the fact that it has an impact. Again, this isn't to say that we don't do it, but I
Mm-hmm.
think we should be concerned. If the question is should we be concerned, yes. Should we not do it? No. I'm just saying have that awareness, and that's also still a difference because we're not putting up we're not elevating somebody who has committed a crime. We're discussing it, and yes, there are people who may be traumatized and hurt by it, but that's unavoidable with any kind of statements you make. There's a difference between doing that and taking a specific criminal with specific victims and elevating him. That I think is a different set of circumstances. But even in your scenario, I would be concerned. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it, but I think we would all agree you would at least be concerned about how you showed it. You would be concerned and be aware of the fact that there are real people whom you would impact with this.
I think that's fair. The other thing I want to address is an idea that's going out in the chat where someone's saying, "Oh, you can't just murder someone, call it art." Right. Here's the thing: illegal acts, you cannot victimize somebody and call it art. Okay, that's a. I mean, it can still be art, but it's not protected as art. However, there is something going on in our culture where, let's say, I wanted to create a video game or a comic book or write a story or produce a show. There is a thing in our culture where something in that show people find objectionable, and they will harass studios, harass artists, harass publishers, and try to get it removed. Hell, right now, Walmart has removed all violent video game advertisement from their stores because Donald Trump went basically cancel culture, is leaning on games retailers, and is trying to basically pass the buck of gun violence onto video games, and so this kind of thing happens in that respect all the time. So I really do feel like, especially when we're talking about the subject of the art itself, that art needs to be allowed to be offensive. Art needs to be allowed to be objectionable and still exist, and not come with the social repercussions of you're forever a pariah because you created art that offended people. Here's a wonderful example of that happening, and I think again it was wrong. Sinead O'Connor, her
Oh
art
yeah.
was
Yep.
simply tearing a picture of the Pope because of what religion was doing to her country, and she became a social pariah. Her art wasn't played on radios. Her art wasn't played on MTV anymore. And see, and that is, to me, a social detriment.
No, I would very much agree with that. And I think, and not just her, but no, I think you make a very valid point, and I'm
Mhm.
going to start to wrap it up. So we actually have now this show's called In Time, Not On Time, Harry. But we actually have a clock on the bottom right. It's being overwritten a little bit right now because some idiot is screwing up the layout. I have no idea who that is, but he should probably be fired. At any rate,
Screw that
yeah, I know, right? Jesus, what does he think he is? We're trying in general, I think, to keep these down to an hour, and so I think we're gonna start to wrap this up. I'll sort of just, if it's all right, I'll give like a sort of 1 minute say my piece on it, and then you can finish up yours. But I think there's been a very good discussion here, and we are going to try to keep these to an hour, which is why there is a clock on the bottom right so that everybody sort of sees where we are. And I think we're not always going to make it, but hey, for our first one, wouldn't it be nice if something went right? So I think you gave us a lot to think about, and because you're an artist, I think that's a unique perspective. I certainly don't want to give the impression that I agree with you that it's been happening way too much, and we actually got off of cancel culture some on. Well, no, I don't know that we did, but at any rate, um, I
I think it's
think
part of cancel culture.
I think it is,
Yeah.
and I think it speaks to the larger issue. Even if we were talking about a smaller subset, I think the same rules apply. I think this sort of outrage over what artists do has to be tempered in general, because artists are in the public sphere. They're gonna, and anybody who's in the public sphere, you have to. We all we all do have skeletons, but not everybody has trolls looking for all those skeletons. Not everybody is working without a net on live television or on a debate stage with 10 other people running for political office, and we're all going to screw up and say things. And there are people when Howard Dean, which I don't think this is quite the same thing, but it's close, when he did that, yeah, and people were like, oh my God, and I don't even know why that got on people, but for some reason it did. And but there have been politicians who've certainly said things that maybe they shouldn't have said, and have gotten in trouble for it. And I think we expect them to stay to the standard that we would like to project for ourselves, knowing full well that we don't meet that standard ourselves. And I would like to see that in politicians, but also in artists and in a lot of these. We have to be more forgiving. My hope is that we're going to be, as we start to, social media is still really, and the power of it is still reasonably new. And when I was working in high school, I was teaching. I remember a few of the high school kids had put up some very risque photos on Facebook, and a lot of teachers were like, "Oh my God, this is going to destroy their careers. It's going to end everything. It's all done." And I was like, "No, it's not," because they're like, "Well, any employer is going to see that and they're not going to want to hire them." No, because I think what's going to happen is by the time these guys are through college, you're going to have a hard time finding someone who hasn't put something risque up on Facebook, somebody who hasn't, and right now it's still this bleeding edge of people who are having their foibles or their mistakes exposed. But I think by the time, 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to be so used to everybody having this public stuff. I think it's going to change the bar as to what's considered unacceptable. But until then, the people who are taking the brunt of it are the artists and the people who are putting themselves out there in one way or another. And I think it's terribly unfortunate. I do think it is damaging our culture, and I appreciate also you reminding us of just how bad that damage can be, because I think we don't always think about it. But anyways, that's my piece. What were you going to say?
Okay, so the first thing is the one is no public figure, I think, or private figure. It's even happened to private figures, people going after teachers' jobs or whatever. No public figure, no private figure, no one individual should be defined by one random stupid thing. Rationality rules. Any one of us can say something, make a mistake, make a bad argument, and that shouldn't define who we are in the public space forever. I would also say that art requires being sharp. Our culture needs art to be sharp. If we blunt art, if we blunt artists and don't allow them to make cutting commentary, then it's going to be damaging to our culture. And that requires, unfortunately, also allowing some really awful people to create some really awful things in their art, things that I would even find objectionable and not want anything to do with. But you can't have you really can't have a standard where this art over here is cutting and on the edge of a social commentary and is okay, but this one isn't, because of your own. We can't allow our own sensibilities to be as an individual to be the arbiter of what art is and is not allowed. And so I think that is the major takeaway from me, anyways, is that we can't think that our sensibilities should be the arbiter of what art is, objectionable and what isn't, and that we shouldn't be defined by a single mistake.
All right. Well, thank you. And with that, I think we're gonna head out here now, because we're still working out some of the kinks. Our extra is our intro page. That's what it's going to be for now, but you'll see our schedule up there. We will be having Cheshire Vic on Tuesday, our next scheduled broadcast, assuming hopefully nothing crazy happens in the interim. Otherwise, you will find us broadcasting live if there is some breaking news of either significant national importance in the U.S. or international importance somewhere. Barring that, our next scheduled appearance will be Tuesday, where we will be discussing the effects of social media on politics and culture with Cheshire Vic, who has just joined us in the live chat. We mentioned art and artists, and she heard that and just came running. And and then Wednesday, we have ostensibly scheduled a discussion on non sequitur, and then Thursday next week, our discussion on mythology, superheroes, in particular comic book superheroes, which I think is going to be fascinating. Comic book superheroes and their influence and education on ethics, normative ethics in our culture. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to chatting with you all soon.
Bye-bye.